Okay, hi everyone. This is going to be a little bit longer. Maybe it depends on how fast we run through this, but calls for an interesting discussion in the end. Uh, if you remember, in this idea of reconfiguring modernity, we have already looked at the idea of apocalypse, the idea of history, the idea of language and meaning, and this week we are going to look at the idea of dream and what the idea of dream brings to this kind of reconfiguring of modernity. Yeah. So, uh, just to do a quick recap, last time we looked at reconfiguring meaning and language, and we basically looked at the emergence of the pop art movement and the post-American kind of consumerism, and we focus our attention on two texts by Robert Venturi, which is Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture and Learning from Las Vegas, while we try to establish the ideas of structures of languages and signs. Yeah, so this is what we were looking at last week. Okay. Uh, this week, when we begin with the idea of dream, it is we are going to go back. Jim, go ahead. I mean, you should take this.
Yeah. So today we will be today we'll title the lecture Dream, and we are going to be looking at a few ideas and eventually the work of two architects. Okay, and we're going to be seeing what have been the impulses or inspirations for this. Okay, and like we've been saying this in the past many lectures, that the impact of the World War, both World War One and World War Two, was a huge impact on the way people thought of things, of the way the world was shaped, etc. After those events. And this movement, which was called, and the group was called Dadas, and the work was called as, and the followers were Dadaists. They basically were a group who formed a reaction to what was happening at that time. Okay, and that time I mean World War One. Okay, and they kind of were so kind of disturbed by the idea of what this war was doing, and they said that it is absurd that no one was speaking up against this speaking up against this war, and what the war was leaving in its aftermath, the number of people that were killed, how machines were being employed in this war, etc. Okay, and a group of people mainly in Europe, okay, they came together um, in this time. So during the war, and the war is between 1914 and 1918, and this group of people, they came together to kind of form this group, okay, and how they, and if you see the text here on the right, okay, they said that just like this war was completely unreasonable, they also said that they needed to produce different forms of art, which was art itself, poetry, etc., music also. That would have got that kind of had this absurdist idea, or this absurd tendency. Okay, and the meaning of this word, like what does Dada actually mean? Okay, so it actually in Romanian, Da means yes. So Dada means yes, yes. There's another theory which says it also means horse, I think, hobby horse in French. Okay, so this or a rocking horse. Okay, and they kind of said that okay, it doesn't have to mean anything, and this is what this movement can be called Dada. Okay, a lot of artists. We'll see the work of a few artists in the following slides. And Shirish, can you go to the next slide,
Yeah.
please?
Yeah.
Okay, and the space or the place where this was actually, that it first began, was called it was like a nightclub come, and also functioned like a gallery, and this was a place called the Cabaret Voltaire. Okay, and named after the philosopher Voltaire. This Cabaret Voltaire was a place in Zurich in Switzerland. So this is where it all began. and it was made and founded by this person called Hugo Ball, okay, and his partner Emmy Hennings, and a lot of artists would come to this place, and like because it was a nightclub, they would kind of have their performance, they would show their work, they would recite poetry, etc. Okay, and some of the people who were very actively involved in this space were Marcel Janko, Richard Husselbach, Tristan Zara, and many others. Okay, this space, if you see it, it did not kind of it wasn't open for a very long time, and much like the movement itself, so the movement also just spanned for around 10 years. It died off, or it kind of because of differences, etc. This movement was only for 10 years. Like many other things that we've seen in the past, they also wrote out a manifesto. Okay, and this first manifesto was read out by this is Hugo Ball. Okay, at this picture over here, if you see it, this is Hugo Ball at the Cabaret Voltaire. Okay, dressed up in this really, if you can see what he's wearing, it's like it's supposed to resemble a cloak, but which is made of a large sheet, and he has some kind of other attachments where his hands are, etc. And these pages which are there on either side of him were this manifesto which is written here on this. And if you read also the manifesto, okay, I will just pick a few things. So see this: Dada is the world's soul, Dada is the pawn shop, Dada is the world's best lily milk soap. Okay, everything it stands for this idea of the absurd. Okay, and that is why there are a lot of words just kind of thrown together to make these to make up this manifesto. But if you see the last line, it says, the word outside your domain, your stuffiness, this laughable importance, your stupendous smugness, outside all the parody of your self-evident limitedness, the word gentleman is a public concern of the first importance. And these two last sentences are actually speaking about their reaction, about the whole absurdity or the whole kind of irrationality of the World War. Okay. Yeah, Suresh, can you go to the next slide? Okay, now one of the artists who was part of this group is Marcel Shaw. Okay, and he was a French American painter. For the early part of his career, he painted. Okay, and then this painting over here is a painting from his early career. And if you see his later work, okay, that is when he completely rejects painting, and he says that is only a visual. It kind of works only for the visual. But what about the mind's eye? Okay, and see over here, and he calls it. He says he calls this retinal art. It is only intended to please the eye. And he said no, there has to be art which actually stimulates the. And keeping in with this Dadaist tradition, what he did was, if you see this picture, okay, and this he worked on this thing of found objects. So he took a picture of Mona Lisa and he kind of drew on it, wrote some text on it, okay, and he said that what does this then evoke? Is this a reaction to something? You're trying to understand the a painting, or you're trying to understand that. Okay. Yeah, Shirish, can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
I think it hasn't changed for me, I think.
It's changed here. Just wait, it will come.
Yeah. So these objects, okay, there were a lot more objects. This was, he titled this ready pieces. Okay, so if you see there's a shovel, there's and there is and
Jin, your voice is cracking.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Is it clear
better.
now?
Much better.
Okay. So if you see these objects, okay, they were titled ready-mades, and if you see there's a shovel, there is a urinal, there is a hanger. He took all of these and he placed them in the space of the gallery. The urinal, he just kind of wrote a little like which looked like graffiti, and he put it the other way and he called it fountain. Okay, and he said that this is also art. So like this, he was deeply involved in this, when like I mentioned earlier, in this thing about found objects. Like you find objects, you make modifications to them, and then try and see if they have different meanings. What are he would try and evoke these meanings through different things. Like the bicycle wheel, if it's turned upside down and put on a stool, does it mean something else? That upside down does, or also in the way these artworks were titled. And he said that this is it is supposed to have a conversation with the person seeing these works. Okay. Shirish, can you go to the next slide? Okay. These are works by artists also who were part of this movement. The first one is called The Spirit of Art and Culture by Raoul Haussmann. What he says that the average supporter, okay, because of he's saying that even if you don't speak up against the war, you are a supporter. You may not necessarily speak in its favor, but if you're not speaking up against it, supporter. And he says that this has no more which chance has glued experience, which can be measured by the range of, like if you see, it is attached to the outside of its head. A rule watch, a jewelry box containing a typewriter wheel, some brass knobs, and he's all these machines. Okay, he's also reacting to the machines wherein the planes, the bombs, etc., which were used in the World War, and that is why he's built this thing that we're not thinking of it as people anymore. We're thinking of people as machines, and that is why this this is his. He titles it "The Spirit of Our Time." Another artist is George. Okay, but George is he, although he started out as a Dada kind of supporter, he also went down to kind of reacting to the the class, and is a portrait which he's kind of drawn of a press of somebody who's a big person in the press. Okay, and he's trying to symbolize the bias of the newspapers. It's about a reaction to the media and how what are they writing, bloody arms. Okay, these images are supposed to, like, you have to read them through a reaction of what is happening at that time. The third image on the right is not is in Cologne, okay, in Germany. So this is there. A typical vertical misrepresentation as a depiction of the Dada, okay, where they are saying that the hands are cut off, and these are also it's assembled together. It's like a collage. There's a face of a man with the body of okay, yeah. Shirish, can you go to the next slide?
Yeah,
Okay,
Jin,
this
I'm on
is
the
some
next.
other work by this is some other work by two key artists of the movement. One is Max Ernst, okay, and his work is a little different because if you see, it's called titled he actually takes the the plane, because it's that is used in the World War, okay, and he's saying that there is also he kind of tries to create this like an images, there are these wounded soldiers that are being carried, etc. Okay, and when he's making this collage, he his collages mainly combine people from the military, so like these kind of military images, along with and then other kind of various things. So like if you see, and he's creating these hybrids of sorts. So the plane then kind of twists out to kind of for hands to come out, etc. But also there's a very strong imagery of the military in this kind of image. The image on the right is by Francis, and what he does is he is here because this is he was primarily in New York, and uh, his book is called Love Parade. He's trying to kind of look at a machine very clearly and what the machine can mean, and that's why he's calling it, like, see, everything is so mechanical, and this has even now becoming into the way people are and people behave. So it's about this kind of, it's a metaphor for this kind of for technology, for for the instruments, for mechanics that are used at that time. Shirish, can you go to the next slide? Okay. Another artist who was involved in the later stage, in the early stages as well, but more towards the later stages, was Man Ray. Okay, so this is a name he took on. Okay, and he was a visual artist, and he was mainly known for his photographs. Okay, and these actually photograms which are called as rayographs. These are what he called as rayographs, and in the next slide we will see the rayographs. Okay, Man Ray becomes is an important person because he worked with both the Dadaists and that. Okay, so the Surrealists draw heavy inspiration from the Dadaists, and Man Ray in some sense is in between both. So if you see over here, there is this iron with these spokes coming out, and it's called kado, which means gift, and sorry. And this is a work that he produced when he was mainly kind of influenced by the Dadais. The two images on the right are rayographs. Okay, so they're not photographs actually. You take so he's assembled all these objects, and then you pass light through it, because through light sensitive paper, and these are images that are created because of that. So these are rayographs that he some he called, and one on the extreme right is called feather and matchboxes. Okay, but they are all mainly like everyday objects that are connected together create these rayographs. Yeah, Shirish.
Yeah. Okay. So by 1922 to 24, the entire Dada sort of movement is slowly merging into what we know as surrealism. Yeah? And the artists are moving on to other ideas and cultural movements. Yeah? So although it was short-lived, Dada was highly influential in its questioning and the debunking of traditional concepts and methods, and setting the agenda for future artistic experiments. Its techniques that involved accident and chance were of great importance for the surrealists and the abstract expressionists. As well, conceptual art has roots in Dada. The spirit of Dada has never disappeared, and its tradition has been sustained in junk sculpture and pop art, which in America is also known as Neo Dada. Okay, just to give you a little bit of context of where Dada sort of moves in. Okay, uh, in the years before the World War One, there's another artist that becomes very important. His name is Giorgio di Chirico, and you guys must have seen some of his paintings. Chirico founded what he called the School of Metaphysical Art Movement, which profoundly influenced the Surrealists. Yeah? His most well-known works would often feature Roman arcades, long shadows, mannequins, trains, and illogical perspectives. His imagery reflects his affinity for the philosophy of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, which is very important, because Nietzsche is also the one who declared that God is dead, and if God is dead, then what happens next? Yeah, and the war actually sets this entire sort of turmoil into motion. Chirico himself is very much interested in the mythology of his birthplace. He's of Greek origin, yeah, and as you know, in the Western world, Greece forms the core kind of roots of origin. Some of his paintings on the left hand side is called Song of Love. Uh, there is a deep level of kind of melancholy in his paintings. Ordinary objects get sort of exaggerated scales and get placed with other large objects which would have otherwise had much larger scales. So there's a juxtaposition of scales in his painting, and color and light play a very important role in the way he chooses to render. The one on the right hand side is called Disquieting Muses. Okay, again, a lot of his paintings would appear that they are set up in a kind of a landscape of a city almost. Okay, but destabilizing the scales of that kind of city landscape. Yeah. To give you another example, this is a series that he called the squares. Okay, and squares means in literal terms the piazza or the square in the Western kind of urban context. But the square gets played out in many different ways. Okay, there is always a sense of horizon at the far, but the perspective is very distorted. The distorted perspective allows for scale manipulation. Okay, many of these things actually fascinated the surrealists deeply. Yeah, it gave them a chance to look at things that were not necessarily confined in the limited Cartesian kind of conceptualizing of the art space, so it allowed them to break free and put. There are, of course, in Chirico's paintings a lot of objects of modern kind of invention as well, including the steam and the train that you see at the far end on the other side. In the years before the World War I, of course, he founded the kind of metaphysical art movement. His most well-known works often featured Roman arcades. Yeah, I've already mentioned this. Don't know why this is repeated over here. Yeah. So this leads us to a very important kind of a moment, which is the first Surrealist Manifesto. Jin?
Yeah, so we just saw the Dadaist manifesto, the Dada manifesto rather, in the early part of the presentation. And in 1924, okay, there were some people who were part of the Dada kind of movement, or were inspired by them, and they formed their own group, okay, which was, and they called themselves the Surrealists, okay. And in 1924, okay, just like one, in a matter of kind of 2 weeks, okay, there were two manifestos that were written, because there were a group. They were a group of people who had the same ideas, but they did not agree necessarily on what each other was saying. So this first manifesto was kind of published by someone called Ivan Gogol, okay, and if you see, and this was just one kind of manifesto. Shirish, can you go to the next slide?
Yeah. Yeah, the second Surrealist Manifesto, which was written by Andre Breton, actually illustrates many of the sort of core tenets of the Surrealist kind of imagination. Yeah, I'll just read out parts of it from the second paragraph. We are still living under the reign of logic. This, of course, is what I have been driving at. But in this day and age, logical methods are applicable only to solving problems of secondary interest. The absolute rationalism that is still in vogue allows us to consider only facts relating directly to our experience. Logical ends, on the contrary, escape us. It is pointless to add that experience itself has found itself increasingly circumscribed. It paces back and forth in a cage from which it is more and more difficult to make it emerge. It too leans for support on what is most immediately expedient, and it is protected by the sentinels of common sense. Under the pretense of civilization and progress, we have managed to banish from the mind everything that might rightly or wrongly be termed superstition or fancy. Forbidden is any kind of search for truth which is not in conformance with accepted practices. Okay. He goes on to say Freud very rightly brought his critical faculties to bear upon the dream. It is in fact inadmissible that this considerable portion of psychic activity, yeah, has still today been so grossly neglected. Okay, so Breton actually insisted, like Freud, that as a psychological activity, the dream needs to be paid much more attention, and he outlines four kind of tenets of this kind of way of thinking. Number one, within the limits where they operate, dreams give every evidence of being continuous and show signs of organization. Memory alone arrogates to itself the right to excerpt from dreams, to ignore transitions, and to depict for us rather a series of dreams than dream itself. Number two, let me come back again to the waking state. I have no choice but to consider it a phenomenon of interference. Yeah. So he calls the waking state as the state of interference, whereas the dream actually has some kind of continuity at the back. Okay. Third is the mind of a man who dreams is fully satisfied by what happens to him. And the fourth, he says, I believe in future resolution of the two states, dream and reality, which are seemingly so contradictory, into a kind of absolute reality or surreality. Okay, this is where he introduces the term surreal, if one may so speak. It is in quest for this surreality that I am going, certain not to find it, but too unmindful of my death, not to calculate to some slight degree the joy of its possession. Yeah. So this is the core tenets of the second manifesto. Yeah, Jane.
Yes. Okay, and this is some we're going to see some work by the Salvador Dali. Okay, his works are largely credited to being surrealist works. This is an image I'm sure most of you have seen before as well, and it's titled "The Persistence of Memory," where the clock, like kind of because like if you remember what Shirish was saying in the earlier, the idea of the dream, the idea of the absurd, the idea of the omnious is all kind of coming together in these artworks, where the clocks in this case are just melting over, kind of dripping over things, or there is something like, there's a landscape that is drawn. He also drew heavily, he drew landscapes a lot. Okay. Shirish, can you go to the next slide? Or this one, which is called the elephant. Okay, the idea of giving a quality which is different from what they know. So, like, elephants to be these kind of really muscular, heavy, huge animals, but he kind of makes them almost floaty by giving them these kind of spidery, spindly legs, and them kind of still kind of carrying some kind of large object over them. Again, take a look at the landscape, see the little objects that are strewn around. Okay, so these dreamlike states are something that he tries to create all the time. Also, in the next slide, which is called Living Still Life. Okay, and we like these because these were very common paintings at the time, that you assemble a set of objects and you draw them out. If you can see here, the objects are supposed to be moving, where he's saying that they've all kind of come to. There is the table on which these objects have been made, but these objects have now come to life and they are moving. They are either kind of moving in a lot of speed. They are startling somebody else. Okay, so they're all kind of dream in a sequence of some kind. These paintings that he's making. Okay, Shirish, can you go to the next slide? And there was this magazine called Minotaur, okay, and it was between 1931 and 39, okay, that this Minotaur was actually it kind of functioned as a magazine for the surreal artists, and they were not just creating art; they were also poets, they were writers. So surrealism was a much larger movement in that sense, and all these kind of works were published in this magazine called Minotaur. Shirish, this now there were a lot of exhibitions or that were being held to let people know about what this whole movement was about. And we look at one today, and these were held in England, in Germany, etc. But we will look at one today, which was called the International Exposition of Surrealism, and this was in 1938. Okay, and it was held in Paris. If you see here, so the invite, put this invite over here, and this invite, if you see this image, okay, it's actually an image from the 1900. And can you see this character with this hair all kind of this kind of wavy flowing hair? Okay, this character was actually what was called as an automaton or a robot. Okay, and that's the first kind of object, or which I don't know if I can call it an object, or this thing that was assembled and was made to behave or function like a person. So so what we would call a robot. Okay, this was this automaton, and this automaton was titled Enigma Rel, and it was a great sight for people to see this Enigma Rel in because it was scary. At the same time, it was in awe. They were in awe because somehow there was science and technology that they were able to make this, and that is why they used this Enigma Rel, this picture of Enigma Rel walking in a street on the invite. The people who are very closely involved or rather were responsible for the setting up of this exhibition were two people called André Breton and Paul Eluard. Paul Eluard was a poet. Okay. Marcel Duchamp, whose work we saw earlier, was the one. André Breton and Paul Eluard never really, were on common ground at all times. But it was Marcel Duchamp who actually was able to bring them together and say that, okay, both ideas would work. Marcel Duchamp is also a very important character if you see generally in the art because of a lot of things, and one of them also being the creation of this private art collection, and his kind of connections to Peggy Guggenheim and all in the later years. But coming back to this exhibition, Man Ray was kind of in charge of the lighting for this exposition, while Max Ernst and Salvador Dali were responsible for setting the theme of this exhibition. Okay? And yeah, so we'll see a little of this exhibition. This exhibition was in three parts. Okay, if you see here, the outside or the forecourt before you entered into the room where all these exhibits were, was called the forecourt. And this forecourt was had this had this object by Dali, which was called the rain taxi, okay, or the taxi Peugeot. Okay, and it was an old vehicle which was covered with ivy and all. And if you see here on a closer look, you see that there are two mannequins. Okay, and these mannequins have things growing on them. They have for one mannequin, his face is or her face, their face is coming out of a shark's mouth. There were all these pipes that were, like a whole kind of plumbing set done inside the vehicle, and because of which there was water falling to resemble rain. Okay, and when you moved from this forecourt, you moved into a space called the most beautiful streets in Paris. Okay, and in Paris actually you have these little cards or these signages where the names of streets are written. So some of them were real streets. Okay, the name of real streets, by some were made up. As part of this exposition is what they did was they got around 16 mannequins. Okay, 16 mannequins were given to 16 artists, and they were asked to create artworks from these with these mannequins. Okay, and these are some of them. These are three of those 16 mannequins that are here on this slide. Okay. And the last part, okay, from this beautiful streets of Paris, we went to the last part, which was this main hall. Okay, and the main hall was practically dark. You had just had what is like a place for a bonfire in the center, which you see in the first image, which threw light on the top. So it kind of resembled as this central space where people were expected to huddle around for warmth. And there were 4 beds in 4 corners. Okay, and these 4 beds in 4 corners were filled with different things. Like here you can see one was covered with moss and had grass and was damp. Another one was just was kind was which had all these feathers. Okay, and these 4 beds in the 4 corners of this main hall were there that day because it literally wanted you to come and sleep and dream, keeping it with the idea of the dreamlike sequence. Okay. When this, we see in the next slide that when this exhibition actually opened, okay, I think that I didn't put this image. So there were also artworks that were featured by, in addition to those mannequins, there were also artworks that were placed in this exposition. But so when they had the opening, okay, on opening day, everything was in darkness, and the people who came to the opening were given flashlights, and it was deliberately done so that there was some idea of mystery, and the people didn't know what to expect, and they had to keep shining these flashlights to see the work onto each other, to see where they were going. And this was all a very kind of crafted, constructed experience. Okay, and these are some of the artists with one of the mannequins that were dressed up. Yeah, Suresh.
So, of course, this is the surreal the exhibition itself uh, uh, created the sense of mystery, the sense of strangeness, a degree of kind of bizarre, which was also challenging the conformity of things that were actually presented. Yeah. A very important kind of sort of way of working which sort of developed during the kind of surrealist phase is also what is called the exquisite props, and you guys must have heard this term several times. The exquisite props developed as a almost as a parlor kind of a game whereby you folded sheets of paper and you drew something, you passed on a sheet of paper to someone else to draw, without really seeing the entire sort of drawing that you have already drawn, and you folded it again and you gave it to someone else, and the results were quite spectacular when the sheets of paper were unfolded. We play this game several times in today's context. Also, we played it with the first year students who came yesterday. The entire sort of entire drawing that was put together yesterday was also through a process of an exquisite props kind of a method to sort of find to find forms and meanings that are inscribed in forms which otherwise conventional methods of drawing and thinking would not allow. And chance played a very important role in being able to create this kind of experience. And yeah. Okay, we are now going to look at two architects in the end. But before we look at them, we are going to look at the work of one architect just briefly, because he in many ways forms a direct connecting link between the artist and the architect. His name is Friedrich Kiesler. he relocated to New York from Vienna, and of course he was very closely associated with the Distyle movement, and I'll show you how he gets associated there as well, and also like how Jinla was mentioning, he was also actively working on exhibitions for the for Peggy Guggenheim, and collaborated with Marcel Duchamp, André Breton, in the Saleh Superstition, and also for the exposition International Surrealism in Paris in 1947. So 38 was one exposition, 47 was another exposition. We don't have much from that exhibition here, but we'll try and find it the next time. So his following his work with the Surrealists, Kiesler began to focus extensively on his most notable project, which was called the Endless House. The conceptual project built on his previous designs for the Endless Theatre, as well as his own theory of co-realism, and I'll explain what that is, in which Kiesler argued for the importance of the dynamic correlationships between objects, spaces, and human experience. According to Kiesler, sculpture, painting, architecture should not be used as wedges to split our experience of art and life. They are here to link, to correlate, to bind dream and reality. In the lineage of the Surrealist painters, Kiesler's house sought to dismantle the divide between the real and the more than real brick by brick. Yeah? He's standing there with a model of his endless house. These are some of the kind of interior sort of photographs of his endless house. Like Dali, Chirico, and Magritte, Kiesler sought to create an interior space that rendered the space of the home as a psychological landscape, both foreign and familiar. Each element of the endless house was designed to poetically manifest essential elements of dwelling. Foregoing doors, spaces folded into one another, only delineated by their materiality, while furniture folded out of womb-like interior walls, and a traveling light followed occupants throughout the seamless endless volume. So you see, it has strange openings from the outside. Yeah, that's again the same model from the other view, and the series of drawings that he actually constructed in order to be able to create this model. The model. Of course, you should remember this is at a time when concrete and its technology is still relatively limited to the flat surfaces. Yeah, it is only much later that folded concrete could be created like this. Of course, there were domes that were already in the making. But one of his most interesting sort of exhibitions was in the 1925 Paris exposition uh, of decorative arts. If you remember, where Corbusier also had put up a pavilion, where he created a kind of a space which was called the City in Space. Yeah, and this was actually a multimedia exhibition, perhaps one of the first kind of multimedia exhibitions which use projected screens and light and color in order to create the kind of immersive effect. What one of the arguments that he was trying to make was that let us not have more walls, and he wrote a manifesto for this. No more shutting up body and soul in barracks, the whole barrack culture with or without decoration. What we want is transformation of global spaces into cities, to release ourselves from earth and the static kind of axis. No walls, no foundations, a system of tension in open space, and the provision of new possibilities of living, and thereby requirements that will transform the society. He was I mean, the style movement people were very directly attracted to this particular exhibit, and they in fact took him under his kind of fold. This manifesto was put in the style kind of manifestos that were produced later on as well. Yeah. When he moved to New York, he continued his work in what is called the idea of co-realism. Okay, so his argument is that each painting represents a definite unit in itself, just as in one family, each member is of distinct individuality, yet their firm cohesion into one is inborn, no matter how heterogeneous the characters of the members might be. Under these circumstances, it seems natural that each painted unit, particularly when protruding from the wall and viewed from the side, will also assume the value of a plastic entity. Okay, this is his exhibit at the MoMA. On the right hand side is his exhibit at the that was created for Peggy Guggenheim. And these are again some of the one of the kind of exhibits he created in this same space, during which he developed his idea into a philosophy concerning his conviction that everything is connected and correlated to one another. Kiesler called it co-realism, and defines it as dynamic of continual interaction between people and their natural and technological environments. Okay, correlations between objects, color, human experience, environment, etc. he believed should be considered, since all these aspects and their relationships is part of spiritual process which will lend meaning to life. Okay, so it's not enough to look at a painting in a gallery of the painting itself. He said you have to actually look at the entire space of the gallery. You have to think of the entire experience of actually entering into the gallery from where you have been, and also from your subconscious. Yeah? Again, deeply influenced by the surrealists. Okay. Okay, we are now going to look at the works of two architects, Raymond Abraham and John Hayduk. We begin looking at Abraham's work by actually creating this kind of a binary almost of drawing and building, and I'll explain you what I mean by that. This is an excerpt from an interview of Raymond Abrahams. I've put a link at the bottom. We'll share the PPT and you can pick it up from there. The interview is quite interesting, but I'm going to pull out only some of the major parts. Raymond Abraham is an architect who creates conditions that demand a viewer or inhabitant consider the origins of architecture. This discipline elicits a confrontation between the ideal and the imagined notions of perfection and the real, its physical counterpart. Yeah, so he separates the ideal and the real. Yeah, his architecture, anchored in the specific nature of its material, questions and affirms this metaphysical realm. Yeah, Abraham's is a deliberate and precise investigation of architect's responsibility to be life-giving, etc., etc. And he's interested in the tension between the ideal and the built as an essential condition for architecture. Okay, and he goes on to say, anybody who makes architecture has to recognize that phenomena. It is the ultimate challenge, but one really has to define context, because this tension between ideal and the built remains in the context of building. It's not taking place in the context of drawing. In the context of drawing, he says it's a completely different dialectic. When I draw, the drawing is not a step towards the build, but an autonomous reality that I try to anticipate. It's a whole process of anticipation, anticipating that a line become an edge, that a plane become a wall, the texture of the graphite become the texture of the build. Now, when you translate the drawings, one also has to distinguish between the drawings you make in this autonomous process, where the drawing is the ultimate reality. Yeah, I draw first for myself, not for somebody who is building, which means there has to be an absolute clarity in my mind and the ability to retain the idea that I have established in the drawing. And furthermore, the anticipation that this idea will be built in. Of course, it's a complex process. He goes on to say, from the moment I know that something is going to be built, my drawing becomes something else. And at that point, I draw less and build models immediately. Yeah. He distinguishes between those different phases. So, for example, these are his series of studies of elements of houses. Yeah. And these are the kind of drawings that he is making to actually study some of those elements of houses. What are the elements of houses? Okay, a feast is an element of house, the ritual is an element of house, conflicts are element of houses, satisfaction, memory are all elements of houses. House, which is at the junction of many of these: dreams, birth, morning, absurdity, resurrection, containment, lust, sleep, awakening, coldness, flesh, the morning, the day, the night, light, anticipation, etc. Okay, it continues. The list is very big. Yeah, and he creates these almost like phantasmagoric kind of drawings. Okay, with graphite, with color, to illustrate the ideas of the house. Okay, for example, here is a cloud house. Quite literally, it is a house that is subsumed by the clouds. Okay, uh, or this is what is a house with three walls. Yeah, we have to remember when we are looking at Abraham's work is that there is a distinction that he's already made between what I'm drawing as an autonomous process for myself and my inner kind of sensibilities, for my dreams to exhibit, as against what is a drawing towards the building. Yeah. For example, the house with curtains, quite literally, is a house with curtains. It is subterranean. It has possibilities of light and breeze sort of flowing through the upper core. Okay, and it is situated or sort of anchored into a landscape of mounds of mounds. This is what he creates, which is a collection of 9 houses that come together in this kind of a drawing triptych, identifying each of their kind of landscape anchors. Or this is a house without rooms, and this is perhaps the first kind of drawing set where, like he says, he immediately moves towards a model when he thinks that this is something that can be actually built. So this is what he calls a house without a room. So what he does is he looks at the core kind of functions of the house: sleeping, walking, kneeling, shitting, and things like that. And he says, well, these are the functions, and the house essentially is in many way a container for these functions primarily. And he creates this kind of a shell structure. There's a model of this structure. I'm now going to show you some of his works that are actually built. This is a building called the International Building Exhibition in Berlin. It's a residential and commercial building. Sorry, it's not the Cloud House. That's a wrong title over there. Although, if you look at the kind of conceptual sketches of this building, he is already sort of creating some of those kind of or subconsciously bringing in some of those core kind of ideas of things that are there in his studies or the typologies of houses and buildings. Yeah. That's the plan of the building. The building has a front facade which you saw in the earlier image. The back actually is opens into a kind of a concave that basically creates a sense of looking up into the sky. That's the model. The building is of course it's built with precast, prefabricated building elements and things like that. But it has a duality to it. You know, the front is very clearly sort of the facade that he shows, but at the back there is something else that goes on. The gallery itself behaves as a gallery for the sky. Okay. One of his other important works, which was built in Vienna I think it was in 1968. I'm not sure I don't remember the date right now. Is a large housing project. You should remember Vienna actually has continued to be the place where public housing takes the center stage of most architectural activities post the war period. Yeah? And this is a very interesting scheme because it is not built only by Raymond. It is built by 3 other architects together. Okay, so the master plan is built by Raymond, and Raymond also, if you can see my cursor, Raymond also built the housing blocks over here, the ones that are over here. The ones that are in the middle are built by another architect named Karl Prussia, and there are 2 other architects who worked on the sort of buildings that came on the two sides. Raymond was responsible for building these corner kind of elements in this master plan. That's the master plan. Of course, the master plan challenges the conventional grid by actually tilting the axis and allowing for entry and exit points to meet other existing grids. Sorry, there's a helicopter here. And the buildings that he builds they present a fairly kind of solid kind of a facade. Yeah, use of concrete in its purest kind of form. Uh, on the corners, what he builds are some very interesting structures. One of them is called the Children's House, yeah, which essentially is a spiral staircase that goes up onto a gallery that can then look up into the sky, and almost like a collector of rain. Yeah, so within this kind of housing scheme, he manages to insert these play objects. Which are quite architectural. We find, I mean, they're fantasy objects in many ways. Yeah, some more of the images of the housing block. One of his most important projects actually happened I think in the 19, if I'm not wrong, in the 1970s. This is called the Austria Cultural Center in New York. Uh, in When it was built, architectural critics in New York called it as one of the most kind of radical sort of and welcome sort of building experiments after the Guggenheim in the Guggenheim Museum in New York. The building challenges the entire kind of sort of facade of the high rise as its key kind. This is the models of the building, and you see the section on the right. Raymond says that the building actually is a collection of three components. Yeah. One is it has a staircase kind of a tower at the back, and the second is almost like an independent tower, which is the facade and the entire gallery spaces which are there. The building has libraries, it has conference rooms, a small conference hall. It is the place of cultural kind of exchanges between the Austrian embassy and the people in New York. Strangely, the building also sort of portrays a giant cross in its elevation. Okay, another very interesting architect to look at in the realm of the idea of drawing as an autonomous act, and and the building as an act which is relatively separate from I'm going to go through a series of images which are, this one is particularly called May's house, and I'm going to read what he says in text, because for Haydo the text is as much important as the drawing, and the text and the drawing actually come together to create a sense of what he's trying to get at. He says the inhabitants arrive by boat on the canal. They disembark and move through a snake-like hedge maze. This maze is on a horizontal earth plane. The maze continues up sloping on a 30-degree incline and ends at the edge of a horizontal plateau in front of a high wall with a vertical maze painted on its surface. It is a plan of the maze. Puncturing this surface elevation is a series of different sized square cutouts. Within the cutouts are solid colored planes of blue, orange, brown, red, and black. These cutouts have windows placed within them. The square elevation planes can be raised entirely as in a theatre, revealing the whole room behind. The north wall is deep blue with black metal stars protruding through the surface. In front of this wall, wooden structures are placed that are the extensions of the maze wall rooms. Also between the two vertical walls, painted maze walls, and the blue wall is a series of rooms that act as an internal vertical labyrinth. The star-studded blue wall faces a dark pine forest. Across the canal is an observation tower. That's the section of the maze house. Yeah, and sorry, you have to tilt your head a little bit. This is the kind of drawings that he makes to further kind of illustrate what this maze house is going to be like. A lot of it is still in black and white here, and he goes on to actually detail some of the components of that maze house. Okay, uh, he then in his drawings starts to actually add the color and the texture and the kind of I mean, it's texture kind of reality to that drawing. You know, he starts to add a kind of reality to it in some sense. Although it is still very much in this surreal. This is also some of the drawings of the cutouts that you look into. Yeah, and that's the entire kind of architecture that sits between the valley and the pine forests on the other side with its cutouts and connections. Okay, this is a series of drawings that he has made for another project. Please remember, these are all kind of in many ways studies, okay, which are in his sketchbook, in his kind of in his paper. Yeah, this is what he is a collection of drawings from another house called the Bullfighter's House. And here's another house which he calls a house in the maze. Okay, that was that was a maze house. This is a house in the maze. Yeah, this is another set of drawings. It's for another house called the Stonemason's House. He writes, a stonemason lives next to a stone quarry and devotes his entire life to building three structures, one next to the other. First, his workplace, built of brick. Second, his church, built of grey granite. And third, his tomb, built of black granite. He also plants his garden hedge. So those are the three houses, stonemasons' houses. This one is called the house for the dead. Death demands that houses have windows so that he can see simultaneously day and night. Death is pleased when man cuts flowers. He sees the act as a premonition. Death is nothing compared to life. Death hates film negatives. We never see the last card of death until it is over. Death inculcates us with dread, then erases the I can't read. Then erases the R. Or then erases the R. So they're dead. Death argues with God about the vertical while man lies horizontal. Death's favorite color is rose. The poet's words are incomprehensible to death. All souls implode when a woman dies. It is then that man's heart disappears. Very, very poetic in its expression, including the this is a peculiar kind of a peculiar project. It's called the House for Quadruplets. Uh, this was a project that was actually built. And these are the kind of drawings that were made towards the building. That's the house for the quadruplet. This is built in Berlin. For Hayduk, architecture and this is my kind of reading. For Hayduk, object and architecture are actually one and the same, and to me he's able to immediately take an object and turn it into architecture, and I think that is something which is quite remarkable. Yeah, and his drawings allow him to sort of take the form of the object and actually bring it in his control or in the control of architecture. This is inside an exhibition where he's put one of those kind of objects. Yeah. there is the object kind of scale manipulation sort of creates the question of architecture, right? At what point does it stop becoming architecture? At what point does it enlarge itself beyond architecture? Of course, his most famous work, which architects love, is called the Wall House. Quite simply speaking, the Wall House separates the kind of set of functions that are of a particular kind with a set of functions which are basically the service functions. So, I mean, you don't need more explanation to what the house is. But the drawings of the Wall House are also quite interesting. Hayduk is one of the, I think, one of the first, or maybe not. I mean, miniature paintings also do this very often. Uh, I mean, he in many ways brought the what is called the zero angle axonometry, okay, or like the straight line axonometry into where the elevation and the plan actually become part of the single surface. That's the plan of the Wall House. As like I was saying, the wall separates the kind of core kind of service functions to the back, and the kind of living functions to the other side. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, we are open for questions.
So we were also thinking that as a suggested reading, you can read the first chapter of The Architectural Uncanny, and it's called Unhomely Houses. We'll also send across a scanned copy of this first chapter, but just in case anyone already has a soft copy, you should take a look at this first chapter called Unhomely Houses. I'll just put it in the chat box also, the name of the book and the chapter.
Yeah. Okay. Ron, you're mute.
Did you guys pick respondents in the beginning? I'm sorry, I could only join later. I got caught up in traffic.
So just to give you a context, we had to wait before we started because we had other classes going on. Okay. And so when they came in, they just jumped. Everybody just Zoom suddenly came in, and we just started. But I think Bansi is definitely one of our respondents this time because she was there before anyone else. So Bansi, are you there? But please feel anyone please feel free to have a go at it. Yeah, don't resist. Okay, and see. Bansi, we're waiting for you.
Bansi, was this work that you had seen before? Had you heard of John Hayduk?
No, I hadn't heard of him, but the thing which Janella started with, Dado, that I had heard of it before, but I was
the Dadas.
Yeah.
Did Kaushik show that to you when you guys were in the first year? He loves Dada.
But Kaushik's work is also Dada, no? Meaning,
exactly.
Yeah.
When I was looking up Marcel Duchamp and I thought of Kaushik so much, I messaged him also. I said, Kaushik, I'm missing you so much when I'm looking at this.
Exactly. I know. It was always his thing, this entire surrealist size thing. The Dada surrealist size thing. I think it comes from that kind of complete dismissal of the art establishment. No? That the art establishment always wants paintings because the paintings becomes a commodity that can be sold. And Kaushik really is somebody who has always had an ambivalent relationship with the gallery. He knows that the gallery is a space where his work can be shown, but he's also afraid of the economy of that entire gallery system. So there's a sort of push and pull kind of thing that happens with him and his relationship with the art gallery. But actually, I was wondering, this idea of the non-linear mode of working. I'm thinking about your design processes and things like that, where very often we are forced to make logical arguments for form. And what the surrealists and the Dada people are doing, including Haydock and Abraham, they're saying there's no such thing. In fact, they're challenging that very idea of logic fully. They're saying the form arises not from some stupid kind of form follows function shit. Okay. And I don't need to justify form. Form emerges from the dream, the instinct, that which is repressed. Form is an expression of everything that you're trying to suppress, your deviant sexualities, your kind of strange desires. There's all of this sort of turmoil that's happening within you. And what the role of culture is to allow that to express itself. It's a way for you to come to terms with everything that you're trying to repress. No? So I think that, sometimes when we think of processes for form making, we very often deny this idea of the accident or the dream. We are afraid of the irrational. And for me, what is interesting about the dream and about this entire group of people is the wholehearted love of the irrational, of danger, of horror, of sexuality, of eroticism, of death, everything that we in human societies try and say nahi chahiye, it disturb karega, no? There's a way in which they are saying ki yaar, let's get it out. No? I think it actually emerges because of the war. Because the war ka rationality has shown itself to be so irrational.
Yeah.
That it has killed so many people. These amazing machines and scientific processes have been so destructive that there is a sort of anger with rationality. And I think that's where the dream emerges from. Excavating the psyche, excavating everything that we are trying to hide, asses that we are, trying to pretend that everything is civilized, when actually at the heart of it, we are all barbarians. That's, I think, where it comes from. So sometimes I wonder about even the processes that we put in place for your design projects. No? That why can't we allow you all to just, play with the idea of form, with the dream, with strangeness, with architectures that are not normal, but rather are something that provoke us to think again. Have you seen Peter Cook's that building in that big strange building in
Graz.
In Graz.
Yeah.
I think I'll just try to get an image and put it here. So anyway, is there anything that you guys would want to kind of talk about the class? I think when we think about allied design in your first year and the way that you all thought about architecture there. Oh, this class doesn't say anything, nah? It just sits back.
We had this project, like our allied design in first year was around this only. That we had this body as landscapes, and the whole semester we were working on similar stuff where each of us had to it was of a poem and we had to interpret it, and then there were many interesting projects which came up as a result of that semester.
That's actually one of the things about the KRVI. This somehow because I think of Kaushik and because of a lot of maybe Sonal interests in art and visual culture, these non-linear processes are a very unusual thing at the school. I think we are probably one of the only schools that really engages wholeheartedly in non-linear surrealist processes for form making.
Yeah.
I don't know. I remember when I started, the first project we did was actually an exquisite corpse. What we had done, Bansi, is that we had asked every student in the class to get one, what was it? I think it was one animal in the second year. One animal, one body part, one place, 5 things, and one word. And then we remixed all of them. So a student got something that they hadn't done before, something else. They got a kettle, a dog, a year, and something in the second year. And the other, chalo project banao. That was actually what the project was. It was super interesting because what happens with these unusual collisions between things is new ideas emerge. I'll tell you one project that we had done, for example. It was a cyborg. We made one long list, which was a long list of, I guess you could call them natural things: caterpillars, frogs, leaves, stuff like that, biological things. Then we made a second list of all artificial things like spectacles, knives, etc. And we made a third long list of places in Bombay, Kanheri Caves, Gateway of India, Marine Drive, SRA buildings, like that. Then we played a game in this class where every student blindly picked one of each. And when they blindly picked one of each, they got three things. So like somebody got, a cotton pod and a knife at Alfred Cinema. Okay. Somebody got a caterpillar and a scissor at Juhu Market. And they had to make a project. Okay. This was what they had to do that. One girl I remember had gotten a locust, a light bulb, and an SRA building. So what happened is he made a beautiful building, and all these buildings were extraordinary because what she did is that she went to the SRA building and she realized that actually the insides of those buildings have absolutely no light at all. And she realized what the locust can do is the locust can come and can eat the building to bring light right in the center of the building. Then she used the texture of the wings of the locust, the kind of fine grain, to actually cut into the building, bringing light right into the heart of it. And in each of the centers of these spaces, she placed what was like a tungsten filament. And the tungsten filament was what she thought, because the tungsten filament is the one that fills the bulb with light. So what she did is she used the tungsten filament as a metaphor for programming. She used them as little kinds of programs within each of these bulbs to light up the inside of the building. So what happens when we are thinking non-linearly is that it gives you the opportunity to come up with completely new imaginations for what is possible within architecture that sometimes we can't think of because we are so caught up with our certain kind of logic itself. We've enjoyed doing this many years. Shirish and I and Janella have worked on many of these. Jin, you worked on which ones for the second year when you were there? Design studio?
Marjuli. Marjuli, yes.
Yeah, was an exquisite
yeah.
Marjuli, yes.
Exquisite blocks out of objects that were found. Yeah.
In Marjuli. Yeah. Yes.
Then Shillong also, na, Jin?
Shillong were the sentences, yeah.
But again,
these that were all kind of mixed and then put together. Yeah.
Then Lucknow was, of course, a complete exquisite box.
Yeah. Do you guys have any other questions, students? Anything that you'd like to say? Do you think that these processes can be fun to play with in a design studio?
No, my question, Rohan, is also whether these are ideas that are reconfiguring modernity. I mean, we've finished one entire section now, right? We have done. We looked at history, we looked at language and meaning, we looked at apocalypse, and we looked at dreams. That was one set. Okay. We are now going to enter into another set of kind of ideas, and that will require. That requires a different mode of actually sort of thinking almost, And I'm wondering whether the students are able to sort of sense that there is the reconfiguring of the ideas of modern in these discussions and in the presentations.
Maybe we should ask them.
Yeah, I'm asking them actually.
Yeah, I don't
say something. Otherwise, or should we do something else? Meaning, like, should we change this way of doing things? I mean, we are enjoying putting together the presentations. There's no doubt about it. Like, I was telling you, Rohan, today, I had no idea Friedrich cases that is okay. Somebody has said something.
These guys I don't know what they are doing. Are you guys listening or what? They are just waiting. I don't know what they are seeing.
Vallavi has shared something from it's from a video game, is it? Or it's real? Yeah.
No, no, it's real. Actually, it's a
Yeah.
project by Edward James. It's English Gardens. I think he was really inspired by Salvador Dali. So this was just like one project that I'd seen very long time back. I think it's
Dali is
quite
the
fun.
artist you all probably know, na? He's the most famous of the bunch.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
all
like
have probably seen Dali's work before.
Yeah.
He's for me, he's not as interesting as some of the others because I find his work to be illustrative more than to be effective. Like he illustrates an idea, like, oh look, this is the something of time. Oh, clocks are melting. ऐसे होता है उसका. Like you saw the Dada iron, na? The what Janela showed, one iron with spikes on it on the other edge. I find that to be more interesting. But like you're looking at, it, you're like, what the hell is that? It confuses you a little bit.
Destabilizes.
Yeah, it destabilizes. Dali doesn't destabilize for me. Dali is personally, I find his work a little like okay, but I understand he's one of the most famous kind of surrealists.
When,
Is that
when
an
I was
interesting thing with a filmmaker called Luis Buñuel?
yeah, we didn't put that clip.
Yeah, it's called the Andalusian Dog. It's on YouTube. You can watch it. It's super interesting. Very short, but it's great fun. That is actually I like very much.
Actually, you have to also like art requires a proactive kind of engagement, na, from the
Yeah.
from the viewer. See, the thing is with mechanical reproduction, the painting comes to you. Okay, but like someone like Kaushik's work, it's difficult for it to come to you. You have to go and physically experience it.
And you have to
That's
work at it. It's not.
Yeah,
It's not easy.
not easy.
I like that some question is asked. Somebody is asking
Yeah.
a question. Ask some question. What is it?
She's saying, "I'm sorry, this is probably stupid, but what exactly does reconfiguring modernity mean?"
So we thought about this for quite a while.
Yeah.
That we wanted to think about कि ये modern के बाद क्या होता है कि modern period, let us assume, modernism, let us assume, is something that we covered in the last semester. Now there's been a big debate concerning what do we talk like uska like what happens after the modern. This is our question. Are we over the modern? Are we now post-modern, as a lot of people like to say? Are we in some ways kind of, how should I put it, more modern than we were earlier? Are we anti-modern? So the problem was that we didn't know how to kind of really think about the next term. The term that is very often used is post-modern for the period that we are talking about, right? But the postmodern presumes that the modern is over and now we are in the post place. And that is not true. I think many of the ideas, especially for us in India, who are living through multiple sorts of periods at the same time, it becomes difficult to kind of say that it's one period or the other. Na? So we decided to kind of think, okay, let's think about how to kind of call this. We knew that in each of these, there was a questioning of some of the presumptions of the modern, or the questioning of rational sciences, the questioning of, the usual idea, form follows function, functionalism, all of these are being questioned. So what we thought we'll do is that we'll call it reconfiguring the modern. That is actually how we came up on this title. Does that answer your question, or does that just confuse you a little bit more?
Yeah, no, I think, I don't know, it's weird when you say, at this age we are modern, this is modern. Because I mean, it's just going to keep changing. Like tomorrow is going to be more modern than today. So I mean, I never really understand how you can classify a time period or, a sense of being as, modern.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think the word modern has many different connotations. Huh? So I just want to, and I think we're using it in one particular connotation. Like the modern, like you're saying, at one level is anything that's new. Huh? That ye to modern cheese hai, huh? There's that idea that it's something new that happens. The other one is modernism, which is a very particular style of architecture that emerges, I would say, something in the 1920s and stays actually as the primary avant-garde mode of working. I think I would say until even the 1950s and the 60s, and in India even until the 70s and the 80s, right? A certain kind of style of architecture. And then there is modernity, which is actually the way in which we are using the word modern. Modernity, actually, if you remember the first lecture, one of the first lectures that we had is looking at the difference between modernity and modernism. Modernity is a particular way in which human beings see their place in the world. I would say the late Enlightenment, the idea of the Enlightenment in Europe, and for and for us, I would say maybe the mid 19th century, were watershed moments in the way that we, or human beings, saw their place in the world differently. God was not taken for granted. God was something that was imagined as an invention by human societies, perhaps, by a few people. The second thing that changes, of course, science really displaced the idea of God. Things could be now explained. And that immediately kind of started putting the human being at the center of the idea of, I guess, development. The third thing that changed was nature. You didn't need to be afraid of nature, you could conquer nature. And one of the most important things that also happened at that time was the birth of the autonomous human being that could be free. That I mean, I can be equal to you. Men are equal to women. You know, all of these concepts are not concepts that existed in pre-modern societies. Largely, there was a few exceptions, of course. So that is what we are calling modernity, the kind of new configuration of the human being's relationship with God, with nature, and with each other. So when we are using the word modern in this particular context, when we are saying reconfiguring modernity, we are really talking about how those imaginations themselves took on new forms from the 50s and the 60s. It's not as if it's not as if the idea of equality and justice or man's relationship with nature changed radically, but it did take on new meanings, new modes through which we were trying to achieve those very ideals. That's why the word modern actually has all these different connotations, and we are using modernity with a very particular connotation. We are not saying ये नया iPhone जो है बहुत modern type का iPhone है. No, that is the way that it's very often used in everyday parlance, but we are using it more in the kind of, I guess, theoretical jargon, you can call it, which is modernity, and not modernism, which is a very particular style of culture, literature, poetry, architecture, all of these. Is that clearer, Dia?
Yeah, it makes sense. It's the other different meanings.
Yeah.
Makes like you can't really exchange one with the other.
Yeah. Anyone else has some clarifications? So this like today's lecture, for example, now what happens with the modern is this idea that the human being has like a psyche, right? Psychology, the birth of that entire discipline happens in, I would say, the 900s with the writings of Sigmund Freud. And now there's an architecture to the psyche, that there's this id and there's a super ego and there's an ego and there are all these things that are there. The human being's desires are conditioned by things that have happened to this particular being since childhood. So you now are trying to discover not only man's relationship with the world, but what runs man's desire. So, which is independent from that of kind of, I guess, the divine. You're trying to discover the machine of the psyche. That's a very, very, very kind of important question for modernity. And those are questions that we are still asking ourselves. Why does a person do what they do? So the entire surrealists kind of question is to really excavate those desires through the making of art and culture and things like that. Anyone else?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Rohan, should we just stay here and continue talking for a few minutes?
Yeah. The next. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wait,
Somebody's
I'll
saying
take attendance. Don't leave. Yeah.
Somebody's saying something in the chat box. I can't read. I don't have a chashma.
Vidisha is saying Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah. I can imagine that. I think that surrealism can be seen in all forms. Alice in Wonderland can be seen like that. It's completely crazy, isn't it? Incredible piece of writing. But I think there's a difference between fantasy and surrealism.
Yeah, so I was
Surrealism,
wondering about
yeah,
that. Like,
it's a
what's the
good question
difference?
actually. Okay, so this is my interpretation of things. Okay, I may be completely off. Huh? For me, the surreal ka jo tension hai na, that lies in that thing that that Shirish was talking about when he was talking about Raymond Abraham. The tension that's there between the real and what's in the mind. Like when Abraham is talking about the drawing is the ideal space and our realities are whatever they are. And that can never be resolved. And because they can't be resolved, there's always going to be a tension, an unstable space in between them. Like ये है कि नहीं है पता नहीं, like when you're looking at that iron that Janella showed, is it an iron or is it something to poke people in the eyes with? No? So these are the sorts of tensions that very much are in the air when we're looking at the surreal. While with fantasy, that tension is lost. There's no tension in it. There is only fantasy, a sort of a way for you to enjoy the otherness of that world, flying fairies and elves. What happens in surrealist works, as far as I think, is that your body is very involved in a sort of strange, difficult relationship with it. It disturbs you. It disturbs your body. Like you feel icky sometimes. Huh? Yeah, you feel like something's in your mouth and you're going to vomit or some shit, sometimes like that, right? Because it disturbs your complacency. Fantasy doesn't disturb your complacency. Fantasy, in fact, excites you. What surrealist work usually does is that it disturbs you a little bit. It pushes you out of your comfort zone. That is generally what I would say is a sort of difference between pure fantasy and surrealism. It very often, though, I mean, if you read a lot of critical writing, especially concerning film, you'll find that one very quickly slips into the other. They call it when they'll call a film like I don't know, some random fantasy film with surrealist imagery. Then actually, that's not surrealist imagery. Those are just fantastical images. Surrealist images are those that are disturbing to you. I think if you see that image of from and the Andalusian dog by Luis Buñuel and Salvador Dali, there's a scene with a knife that cuts an eye, or you think it's cutting an eye. Now that would be a classic surrealist image. So I find that sometimes Dali's work is more, if you ask me, more fantasy than it is surrealist. Okay, because it is fantastic. Um, well, you know, while I find some of I don't know whether you guys showed Mercy Cunningham's that teacup, which is furry on the inside.
No, we didn't show the.
No, no.
That is, I think, really because it's a cup which has fur inside.
Yeah.
So you see the cup and you have the instinct of sipping something from it, but it's full of fur. So you can even feel the fur in your mouth just by looking at it. No, it makes you feel like ye kya? That is a kind of surrealist moment for me. It implicates your body in a disturbing moment. It's interesting actually, this entire thing. I would recommend you should see the work of Joseph Cornell also. Beautiful, beautiful work. It's as if dreams have been captured in boxes. Stunning. Okay.
Please read the first chapter. Yeah. Of Architectural Uncanny.
Okay, chalo, I got to go.
Chalo.
Huh? Bye.
Yeah. Okay. No one should we speak?
Yeah, we can speak. Hey,
The-
you guys, students can leave. Bye, guys. Have fun.
Students can.
Work on AD for tomorrow. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Somebody's commented one long comment. Namdar. Visual arts so heavily employed as a means of expression in this part of the world, and how effectively. Now he asked, and how the class has gone on. We can answer next class.
Yeah.
Ishan, thank you for the question. We'll talk about it in the next class. Please ask the question in the next class again, so we can have that chat then. I'm exhausted today.
Crazy.
Yesterday, my third year class, went on till 8 o'clock at night. So I was